represent themselves back to us as if they're the same thing, right? And so Freedom Summer can be appropriated. That's the scary part. And so that's kind of what animates our decision to convene in this way on this particular topic. But we'll get to that. So again, welcome. And this course is going to be co-taught. So my comrades will be joining you next week and the week after that. I think it's possible that we might get a cameo from Dr. Allegra tonight, who is actually local for the summer at least. She works at the University of Texas at Austin. And Felicia Denard, who's in Cincinnati, she'll be joining us in the third week. She's at the University of Cincinnati. All of us are in Black Studies, and we're going to talk about what that means in a second. But about a year and a half ago, I guess it was, when did that Lowndes County documentary come out? I guess it was early 2023, right? Did y'all see that? The documentary about Lowndes County Freedom Organization. What is it called? Is Boomy back there? Boomy, help. What was the Lowndes County documentary called? Just Lowndes? It's just called Lowndes? Okay. So that documentary, which was actually I think Sam Pollard was one of the filmmakers. It's on Peacock or something. Yeah. It was interesting. Yeah, it is interesting. But what's also clear in that documentary is that they were very intentional about including the voices primarily of SNCC veterans, what we call the people who are staff members of SNCC, right? And so it's not that they were only the people that are card carrying that gets that label, but there was a staff, right? There were people that subsisted on, what was it, $10 a week, right? that was the SNCC staff pay. And this particular documentary actually foregrounded their voices. And so if for nothing else, it's good to see for that. But the creative direction of it required more than just seeing it as a final text, right? Especially when it comes to understanding something as complex as Lowndes County. Lowndes County, 1965, is a movement campaign that comes a year after Freedom Summer in Alabama. Freedom Summer took place in Mississippi, 1964. But in many respects, the lessons learned in Mississippi were actually applied to the struggle in Lowndes County. And then it is not a mistake or a departure or some sort of, break that then leads to the Black Power iteration of the freedom struggle by 1966, which of course that phrase had been around for a while, but it's popularized in 1966. Where else? In Mississippi, right? And so I'm making this, should be a short story, very long. But when that documentary was coming out, Cortland Cox, who is the chairman of the Snick Legacy Project, which was founded in, 2010, after the 50th anniversary of the founding of SNCC, Easter weekend 1960, they decided that they wanted to do a whole range of initiatives to read or write the history of the movement. And this is one of them. Courses. Sitting together, reading together, discussing what actually happened and what we must do now, which is a big part of the Black Studies imperative as well. Not just thinking about this as a historical thing that happened back then. And it's nice. No, what are we going to do? Or as I love the way that younger people say, how's it going to free us? Right? And so this course, the Lowndes County course came first. This course came next in terms of creation. We also have two other courses that we created. One on the meaning of direct action. What does it mean to pursue a strategy of nonviolent direct action? And the fourth course that we developed is on Black Power itself as a concept. So we have 4 courses that are ready-made for instruction at all levels. Even though we are college professors, these courses are ready for instruction at all levels. And Each of them are 15-week courses, essentially. We are doing now this course as a pilot. So this is the first time that we've actually taught one of the courses. And it coincides, of course, with the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer, the summer of 1964. And so we're going to get a modified version, really, of what a course like this would actually look like in practice. And so we decided that we got 15 weeks, 15 topics. What's the best way to do it within a 3-week frame? And that ultimately led to the decision to do 1 week's worth of content each day, which is like kind of crazy when you sit down and think about it. But also, to people who self-select being in a course like this is nothing, right? Everybody who is here is self-selected. Nobody is forced to be here. Nobody's getting credit. There are no assignments. There's no exam. We're just here to learn. And so for us, it was important to first start in a setting like this to help work out some of the kinks of the course as we prepare it for wider distribution. We want to give we are going to give these courses away so that anybody can teach them at any location in the world that they want. And so that's the conception of these courses. Again, this is one of the 4. We're going to be doing 3 more. So they'll ultimately there's going to be a whole curriculum. But what are our next 3? Women and Gender in the Movement, the 6th Pan-African Congress. We'll do a whole course on that, 1974. And then the 3rd one that we're going to be doing next is the question of arts and culture in the movement. And so we're really excited to be piloting this particular course. And for today, tomorrow, and Thursday, I'm going to be offering some context for understanding this place that we know as Mississippi. And how is it that SNCC decides to target this particular state for what eventually becomes Freedom Summer, which is but a small part of this larger project of the Black freedom struggle, the struggle for self-determination, the struggle to ultimately transform the world that we can all trace back to these particular moments. So I want this to be interactive. So please feel free to disrupt me, to ask questions. That includes people who are in, the chat, the cyber world, who are in the chat. Please, anytime you have a question, please disrupt and ensure that my voice is not the only voice available. But I'm going to start with a question that I have, just to give people in the spirit of interactivity, really 2 questions. And then we can kind of move on to talking a little bit about how we might approach the study of Freedom Summer. I'm going to talk a little bit about Black studies and how Black studies uniquely might approach the study of Freedom Summer. And so my first question is, did everybody get the readings and the resources? So everybody here, hopefully online, everybody has access to that. If not, if you don't have access, please let me know. And I'm going to give you all my personal email. My personal email is JOSH, Josh, my first name, F, like in Weezy F Baby. That's literally where this comes from. In 2007 when I got a Gmail for the first time. Anyway, and then Myers, MYERS @gmail.com. One word, Josh F. Myers @gmail.com. Shoot me an email. I'll make sure that you have all the readings that are necessary for this course. The syllabus, however, can be accessed from SnickLegacyProject.org. It's right there on the front page. All you got to do is 1 click, and you got the PDF for the syllabus. Again, this is the modified syllabus. After we finish this course, we're going to make available the full range, the full 15-week range, so that people who want to then teach it themselves after having been through this or however you want to do it, you can have access to that. What I love about the syllabus or the syllabuses, both are correct actually, that we've actually created is we actually have teaching notes for each week, each of the 15 weeks or each of the 15 topics. So we tailored it to people who are comfortable lecturing. We've tailored it to people who are comfortable with large group discussions. We've also tailored it to people who are interested in doing flipped classrooms. And so there are like 3 modalities for how to teach this course, each course, in fact. And so it's applicable to formal educational spaces. It is applicable to organizing spaces like the People's Forum. It is applicable to community centers and churches. Wherever people need this and want this, we have created a course that we can actually tailor it to those people. And also, somebody asked this, we were on Mark Lamont Hill show about 2 weeks ago. Somebody asked us, what about the kids? I'm like, it's tailored to the kids as well. There's not a lot of reading. There's enough reading, but there's not a lot. And of course, that can be modified in terms of how people navigate taking children through this as well. And this is a big concern, of course, because freedom schools are popping up all over the country, given the way that history has been excised from the curricula all around the country. And so a major effort has been put in place in places like Florida, involving the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH, places like Texas, places like Alabama, to teach courses like this. And so one of our main goals is to not have us be the people that are doing the instructing, right? To empower people who want to instruct, who want to organize in those particular places, to be armed with this particular knowledge so that they can go and teach these courses themselves. So that was my first question. My second question, and this is for people who are in the chat, we're going to make sure you enter this into the chat just to have a record of it, even though we may not read everything. But for the people who are here in person as well, if you are comfortable, what brings you to this particular course? And so anybody wants to share? Yeah, go ahead. Yes. Okay. Appreciate it. Yeah. Nice. Okay, cool. Appreciate it. Okay. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Sounds dope. Yes. Oh my goodness. Okay. Okay. Yes. Awesome. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Cool. Yes. Kind of want to start now with constitutional people because Nicole is here as an attorney. But we'll get to that. Bob Moses and his whole concept of constitutional people. Thank you all for sharing that. That's really helpful. And I know Boomy's back there listening. Boomy is the glue that makes this work. So this is Boomy Samuel, who from New York, so he's home. Works very closely with the Snick Legacy Project, making this work from a technical aspect and a logistical aspect, but also conceptual, because those things work together in Snick, right? Can't be abstracted. So not everybody can do logistics for Snick people. It takes a certain kind of person. In fact, I first met Bumi Samuel when he was running Philadelphia's Freedom Schools back in the day. And this whole concept of taking the children away from the mainstream educational system and then going back and infiltrating at the same time, right? So the concept of Freedom School, we have a whole session on it. I think Badur is going to be leading that section. In fact, she was on Millennials and Killing Capitalism, as you said, yesterday, talking with Charlie Cobb, who is one of the originators of the concept of freedom schools. Still walks the earth, right? And so definitely check out that interview. It's still on YouTube, I'm sure. But this notion of not just supplementing, but ultimately resituating what the center of education is. It's in the community. It's not in the system, right? Even as there's an argument to be made that we created the system, right? Du Bois talks about that in Mississippi, is very much has a case for that. There was no way that these redneck planners was going to create a school system for black people after Reconstruction, right? Or during Reconstruction. And so it must have been somebody else that created it, right? And so these things are really important. We'll talk about that in a second. So by the time you get to the 1960s, not only did the massive resistance to Brown manifest in violence, right? But the education system had not been centered on black people's needs. And so the Freedom School concept was an attempt to take the kids away from it, right? To supplement the things that they weren't getting. Whether it's algebra or African history, like all of those things were done. And it was a demonstration of the power of local people in Mississippi to use whatever resources that they had to oppose a racist structure. And education was a major, major part of that. And so just as they're doing the voter registration projects all throughout the summer of 1964, they're building these mini institutions. The kids get together from 9 a.m. to 1, and we're going to study this. 'Cause y'all can't vote yet, but at some point, y'all will be able to, right? And so sometimes voter registration overdetermines a little bit what the goal was. We have to understand what the ultimate goal was beyond just understanding the idea of the vote, right? And the ultimate goal was power. The ultimate goal was self-determination. It wasn't voting without a cause. It wasn't defensiveness either. It was voting to empower and understanding that this was a tool of empowerment. And so what does it mean for these people to come from the people who believe that they should acquire power and have power, right? That's why this course uses a Black Studies approach. We don't just drop in the middle of the year of 1964 and think we can actually understand something. Things are happening all throughout the state, all throughout the region, all throughout the world that impinge upon these Black Mississippians' efforts to free themselves from this grasp of this white supremacist regime. And so for Black Studies, we look at things from the long view. And so these are people who are heirs to a tradition, not creators of a tradition. They are heirs of people that resisted. They ain't the first time Black Mississippians stood up. Who are the people that they came from? So one label that we might use is that, this is a continuation of a Black radical tradition in the Mississippi, right? And so as you saw with some of these readings, we're just talking about stuff that happened initially in the 19th century, right? The only real revolutionary period in American history is probably the Civil War period. I mean, as Gerald Horne says, some of our friends on the left like to talk about the American Revolution. That's not a revolution. How does a revolution expand settler colonialism? I mean, just start there. How does a revolution expand slavery? Not only did they not emancipate Africans, they expanded the regime. And so the only real revolutionary possibility in this country happened in 1861 and extended maybe to roughly 1875, right? And it was violently put down because the people who were participating in it understood it to be the insurrection that it was. You don't create a Klan if you don't think you need one, right? Mississippi is a site for that. It's an important site because black people were the majority in Mississippi. This is one of the reasons Du Bois foregrounds the discussion about Mississippi in his book, Black Reconstruction. You see my battle copy. I couldn't find my clean copy, but this is the copy I go to battle with, Black Reconstruction in America. And in many ways, that's the Black studies inheritance, is to understand the ways in which these things continue, that we are not just abstracted from this, not only historically 60 years ago, but 160 years ago, 260 years ago, 1,060 years ago, when you're really doing the work, right? To understand this thing as a chain, not as a series of broken memories or broken associations with the past. But the other thing that makes this such important to the Black studies conversation is this also is about us now, right? We must do something in light of knowing something about our ancestors. And I think about this a lot because when you know who they were, when you know what they did, and we know their connections to the thing that we call the state, America, whatever we want to call it, right? Imperialism, whatever, how deep you want to go, right? Then one can't accommodate no more. Like, I can't get in where I fit in anymore. I have to do something differently. I have to think differently and be differently. And I think Mississippi is a great place to study that, not just to study the history of Freedom Summer, but to study the relationship that Black people have to our tradition of struggle and our tradition of resistance, which is why this course doesn't start with the volunteers. Most people start Freedom Summer with the study of the volunteers. And that's a massive organizing feat to get 1,000 college students to come into a state, right? A state where they probably would be violently opposed, and they were, to organize, not to protest, not to picket, not to go to, no, organize. And so it is an organizing feat, right? But a Black studies approach takes seriously the people who are already there. Takes them seriously as not just organizers, but thinkers. And that's how I want us to think about Mississippi. These are not people that were just waiting around for somebody to save them from white supremacy. There's a tradition of fighting back and resistance and this know-how. Robinson says this accretion, right, over generations of collective intelligence gathered from struggle. That's the one I probably need to repeat, right? This accretion over generations. Accretion over generations of collective intelligence gathered from struggle. And it's not bounded by the state boundaries of Mississippi or the boundaries of the United States or the boundaries of even the Western Hemisphere. As it is famously known, one of the most critical organizers in the state, Medgar Evers. He's looking to Kenya. He says, we need a Mau Mau in Mississippi. Names his son Kenyatta. And we can tell stories after stories of this, right? They're looking to the world because they're a part of the world. Mississippi gets this reputation of being isolated. Oh, that's not, it's a backwater. No, they're thinking about the world. When the sharecropper from Ruleville, Mississippi named Fannie Lou Hamer gets to Guinea in 1964, in Sekou Touré's Guinea, or when she goes to New York, right here in New York, and shares the stage with Malcolm X, they're thinking about the global struggle in Mississippi. And it reanimates them, right? Because when you put what we was doing together, as Miles Davis said to, who did he say it to? Trumpeter from South Africa. Yes, thank you. You Master Kayla. He said, when you do what we doing, and when you put it next to what you doing over there, then shh. He said, shh. I probably could have said it, but you know. This idea of understanding that there are connections. And so let's move quickly to, by the way, I have to say this. Part of the tradition that manifests in Mississippi that lets us know that it's a crystallization of all of this energy that Black people have been putting out is the blues. I don't want to say the birthplace, the manifestation of the blues. It's in the very region where this freedom struggle activity pops off. These are blues people, in other words, as Amir Baraka would say. Probably the bluesiest people in the whole hemisphere. I think that matters a great deal to how we might understand this, and also how we might understand this from a Black studies perspective. I have this paper that I probably need to do something with called Blues for Black Studies, where I walk through how the sound of the blues helps us better situate our relationship to the thing that Black studies tries to foster a relationship to, which is the soul of Black people. What does it mean that these people created, this is where the blues manifested, right? Clarksdale, Mississippi, for instance, right? One of the great songs, The Last Train to Clarksdale. People like Robert Johnson, the originator, if you will, of this Delta sound. In fact, they call it the Delta Blues. And so I want to pause here and see if anyone has any questions. I want to check on my people online, see how y'all are doing online. And yeah, how y'all feeling? You got somebody online? Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. This came up in Mark's show. 2 weeks. What was it? 2 weeks ago now, I guess. Number one, freedom schools still exist. So we're sitting here at our freedom school. There's a freedom school happening. If there are freedom schools happening all around the country right now. The CDF, Children's Defense Fund, founded by Marion Wright Edelman, who's a SNCC veteran, institutionalized in many respects the freedom schools. So that's happening. I also believe, however, that you mentioned meeting them where they are. When we were on Mark's show, that was one of the kind of questions around how do you engage new media. And I don't just call it social media, I call it new media, because there's a whole different way of engaging information that has come about as a result. And also I think we have to understand that we can create those types of forms on our own terms at the same time, right? Another reason I'm glad Boomy is here, because that's what we're doing with Snick Legacy Project as well. And so this kind of course, while kids, youth are absolutely invited to come, it's just only one prong of our efforts in the Snick Legacy Project. We're doing other stuff too, right? We're creating a YouTube channel. We're enhancing our social media presence. We're developing a podcast. We're developing things that are not sit down and read a book to engage not just young people, but right now everybody. But certainly that's going to be the space where young people will probably see us first. I think Boomy had something to add. Okay. So online, for people that's online, the question was, how do we engage the youth? And what do we create to engage the youth to meet them where they are? And so I mentioned, the fact that freedom schools still exist is like the number one thing that we have to remember. If you're in a major city, there's probably a freedom school that you can get involved with. The one that I know the most about is Philadelphia, and the way that Greg Carr revamped that curriculum years ago, and thinking about the way things that they've done, I've seen like the transformation in young people myself. And one of the things that's so unique about that program is whatever the quote unquote adults are reading, the kids are reading. It blew my mind to see them reading Black as a Country by Nikhil Pal Singh as high schoolers. I was like, wait a minute. I struggled with this in college. But the idea is we're going to work through it. We're going to be patient. We're going to go slow. We're going to work through it. Because if an idea is worth knowing, it's worth working through. And that's the kind of approach that I still take. Like, if I'm talking to a young folk, you're going to read Black Marxism because that's what you need to know. And whatever it is. And so that takes a level of patience, and you have to, create space for students to know, for children to know that, yeah, it's going to take some time for you to actually get it. This is not something that, a TikTok explainer is going to get us to. It's just not. Even some of the best TikTok explainers won't. And so that's part of it. And I'm struggling with it now because, I'm going to date some people in here, but college freshmen were born in like 2007, right? So digital natives, but more than just digital natives, social media natives in many respects. This is what they know primarily, right? There was no alternative, not even TV, right? And so the idea of getting it quickly is a major thing that appeals to them. And when they create these, artificial intelligence, mechanisms where it will spit out a answer and that answer can get you to the next step, but the next step is not comprehension. The next step is completing a task. That becomes very attractive. And I have to sit down with some of them. It's like, no, that got you to the next step, but you don't know anything. And that's a real tough pill for some of them. Like, but it gave me the right answer. It's like, nah, that don't mean you know it. And in fact, that's not even the right answer. And the reason I know it's not the right answer, because I know it. So, yeah. We're in tough times, but I think like creating spaces like this where we can work through those ideas are going to be even more critical, particularly for young people. And I can just tell you, as an example, this might be extreme, but we have a course that we teach at Howard every summer where it's not our rule, but it's the rule of the program. They only get 1 hour of cell phone use a day. So they're there for 5 weeks. It's like a bridge program. Introduction to college, right? They can't use their cell phone but for 1 hour every day. They can't bring their cell phone to class. They can't bring it to lunch. Which of course builds community in some, because it's like 60 of them. Like now they know each other. They have to know who each other are, right? And so when they take our class, the attention is literally on us for 3 hours. I've never seen anything like it in a classroom setting. They be locked in, y'all. Completely locked in. And you as an instructor or facilitator, when the audience is completely locked in, that makes you lock in. My athletes in the room, you be in the zone, right? There's something to it. There's something to the attention economy. And I think that example really like helps me understand it a little bit, because when you don't have the distraction, right? When you are forced even, I don't even want to use that word, but when you're forced not to have it, you might resist it at first, obviously, but then you get to a place where, oh shit, I know stuff now because I don't have this thing that is distracting me. And all the new information, and we see it work, right? That we give them over this course of 5 weeks, they're able to spit it back. And they will come in, because we do a diagnostic at the beginning. Like, what do you actually know first day one? By the time you get to day 20-something, oh my God. It's radical. And I think that speaks to possibilities. I'm not saying we take everybody's cell phone, but I'm saying we replicate this thing of being able to get kids to lock in whatever way that we can, because they're brilliant. They come from us, and we come from them. So they got no choice but to be brilliant. But how do you get them to lock in is the question. Yes.
I have a bunch of questions, but you just said something that often confounds me, which is the idea of deep study and being able to get folks to actually engage in deep study in order to even build the class consciousness necessary to start to organize in a way that can get us to some sort of tipping point and mass.
Mm-hmm.
Move like that, build people power.
Mm-hmm.
And I invited a few comrades here who I have deep discussions with
Mm-hmm.
to come here and like to deepen the study. But it's always like that hurry as well.
Yeah.
I'm not an educator. One bit by many terms.
Sure.
Right? But trying to communicate the things I'm learning and kind of
Mm-hmm.
get that across, but I find it difficult. In an interview, the gentleman was talking about his buddy who wouldn't study, that he was trying to get to on a team with, but
Yeah.
yeah, that's
It's hard. I mean, it's really hard. But again, like just in this city, like there are so many examples of people who've done it, and like I study the study group tradition. It is like one of the most fascinating things to me, because it's easy to accept them, particularly in our communities, that we don't read or we don't do things like that. Black people are some of the most readingest people historically ever. And not just in the Americas, but in terms of the larger history of who we are. Like literacy is a huge deal. It's a sacred deal, right? And so a lot of our traditions of acquiring literacy and the depth of study that animates so much of our, not just our revolutionary, but even some of our religious traditions, right? Like this is dead serious. And so how do you lock into the thing that makes you, right? Because that seriousness affects you at some point. You want to counter somebody that exhibits it if you're in a black community at some point. And the question becomes, do you lock in or do you run away from it? And a lot of our people are running away from it, which is not to say that they can't come back. It's not going to be, if I reject it at first, I'm lost forever, right? And that's the thing that keeps me going, because I know that everybody that I'm encounter is not going to adapt a regimen of reading whatever, how many books a year and teaching and telling their kids and everybody's not going to do it. But they might do it the second encounter or the 20th encounter. Like, you just remain consistent and understand that it's a journey. And I think that that's what allows people to keep going. And it is discouraging, but there are these moments like I had with the students over the summer, right? If I wasn't prepared for them to be locked in, it wouldn't have mattered, right? If you didn't, as Tony Cage Bombara told June Jordan, you got to have something to give them, because they want it. Eventually, they'll want it. But if you ain't got nothing to give them, might as well not do anything, right? But her verbatim quote was, whatever you have to give, they will take it. So you better make sure that you have something to give. Eventually, right? I think about seeds a lot. Planting seeds. Sometimes as farmers we fail, right? But you learn from the failure, and you learn that in order for a seed to propagate, the setting has to be correct. A lot of things have to be correct. And even after it propagates, that doesn't mean it's going to be a healthy plant. So you got to come back and return and care for it and allow it to grow, be connected to it. George Washington Carver used to talk life into his plants. Right. And so all of that is really important. That it's like human life, as Du Bois talks about, the rhythms of human action, right? The rhythms of life. It's a rhythm. It's a continuation, right? You can't let the beat stop. You have to keep going. And so that's my advice to people who are struggling with that. I mean, if you're doing it, you're not doing it in vain. Somebody is listening. Somebody is affected. Somebody is moved. But you don't stop doing it. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So the question is for people online, what's the relationship between understanding how we might link study to material conditions when people may not be able to see it at first, right? My favorite rejoinder that people have, because I like to tear it up, is, well, I can't eat a book. I'm like, yes, you can. Let's walk. But, I mean, so this is a beautiful question to link to Freedom Summer, right? Because organizing starts from addressing material needs. Bob Moses, who we'll talk about in a second, would go into a community in Mississippi and he would ask them questions about what their life was like, what was going on, and they would realize, oh, this community is short flour at the end of every week. How can we get flour? Or they don't have winter coats over there. It's going to be a tough winter. What are we going to do? Those are major questions for organizers. And this is literally what they addressed in Mississippi at the start. They didn't come into Mississippi quoting the Constitution. No, you have the right to vote, right? No, they came in saying, all right, what can we do? What's your life like? Like, what's going on? And then they linked the fact that you didn't have no winter coat to the fact that you were not considered constitutional people. But that comes later on. What comes first is, let's find you a coat. This is something that organizers during the early part of the 1960s had to learn how to do, because no other organizers were doing that particular work when it came to national civil rights organizations, except for SNCC. And it was young people, right? 17 years old, 18 years old, 19 years old. So go back to the young people question, right? They had to learn to link material needs to these deeper societal questions, which again, if you couldn't do that, then it just becomes, I'm going to spend my whole time organizing, look for winter coats, right? But it wasn't that. It was, we're going to do that, then we're going to have a mass meeting, then we're going to have a freedom school, then we're going to have a canvas, and then we're going to do all of those things were imbricated for them, right? But they too had to grow into that. They too had to grow into that. Charles Payne, who was one of the, Charles Payne's book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, is one of the books that we will be studying. Talks about this a great deal in his early chapters when he focuses on what it means to organize and what it means to address these questions of material conditions in our communities. The ideal course of power is, once we acquire power through whatever mechanism, as Malcolm says, right? Ballot or the bullet, right? It's about power. When we acquire power, the question of material needs becomes a question of who wields power. And that's what they were getting folks who may not have the full awareness of that to ultimately understand. Great question. All right, so and again, pursuing our Black Studies approach, we got to ask a few questions. Who are the people of Mississippi? Who are they? Who are the people of Snick? Right? And ultimately, how does pursuing these questions of who they were, help us understand the how and the why of Freedom Summer? Who are the people of Snick? Who are the people of Mississippi? And how do these questions of who they were help us understand the how and the why of Freedom Summer? I've already given you a little bit about who these people of Mississippi were, right? Blues people, descendants of Africa, particularly West Africa, particularly a lot of the Senegambian region of West Africa, right? A lot of the Bight of Benin region of West Africa. These are the Yoruba peoples, the Mandinka peoples, right? The Bambara peoples. We can actually drill down that far when it comes to knowing who these folk were, right? There's a great deal also of West Central Africans, the Bakongo speakers, right? These are also people who were grabbed from other parts of the region, including the Caribbean, and taken to a state that's relatively new on this scene. Mississippi comes into the possession of the United States as a consequence of the Louisiana Purchase, which of course only happens because of our folk in Haiti, who beat the French so bad that they got to write off their territories in North America. So the United States acquires it with in a bargain deal, which allows for the westward expansion of slavery. The ironies of war, which is why the Haitians are like, it ain't just about freeing us, it's about freeing the whole hemisphere. Because we can't be free in Haiti and still have slavery anywhere else. And we see the implications of that even today. That's another lecture in another course. But it's important to understand that Mississippi is new, which means that it doesn't have the old guard of a Virginia, of a South Carolina, of a Georgia. These traditional aristocratic regimes of white supremacy. These are rednecks. Some of them newly rich, who take our ancestors and deposit them in Mississippi. A lot of them are moving into the state to ultimately expand this regime. And by the time that they discover that the soil in Mississippi is highly fertile, and that cotton will really, really be king here, the Civil War begins to pop off. But so many of our ancestors have been taken again, this is internal, domestic slave trade. Been taken from other parts of the country, in particular from what is called the Lower Mississippi, right? That the state is majority black by 1860. There are more black people in Mississippi than white people. During the war, just as was happening all around the country during the Civil War, black folks who are in Mississippi are running away. Du Bois, in this really critical book, Black Reconstruction in America, which, by the way, I teach. I know it's 727 pages, but I still teach it in my college classes at Howard. They're running away as part of what he calls a general strike. And by calling it a general strike, what Du Bois has done is he affords enslaved Africans a consciousness to understand themselves, why their labor had to be withdrawn during the Civil War. That's really important, y'all. General strike is a Marxian concept that ultimately says that we can bring capitalism to its knees if you just stop working. So enslaved Africans in the South brought the Confederacy to its knees by stopping working during the Civil War. Black folks in Mississippi were part of that. But what is also happening is there are rumors of insurrection. This thing about rumors, right? Most of the major insurrections that are foiled in the Western Hemisphere are foiled because somebody investigated rumors that turned out to be real. Denmark VC, 1822. Gabriel Prosser, 1800. Denmark VC from my home state of South Carolina. Gabriel Prosser from Richmond, Virginia, right? Those are some of the major ones, but there are a lot of conspiracies that were revealed. Why would black people plan a rebellion during the Civil War? What does that tell us about what they knew to be the aims of the Civil War? That was kind of not rhetorical, but let's make it rhetorical, and then I'm going to answer my own question. You rebelled during the Civil War because Civil War didn't start off about you. Through the rebellion, black people make it about them. This is really important because we're not talking about a people who don't come from a tradition or a lineage or struggle. Fannie Lou Hamer's great-grandparents were part of this, right? Even if we don't know their names. Even if they didn't directly participate. It had to come across their agenda, their minds one day. It's like, dang, they doing all of that? Should I participate or not? Which means that there's something happening already. Fannie Lou Hamer doesn't create it. And so, ultimately, this is a state where you see a lot of activity among enslaved Africans, whether it's running away, whether it's thinking about revolt, thinking about rebellion. It tips the scales of the meaning of the Civil War, which means that once the Civil War is over, who are the people that need to ultimately address the questions of what the country will be? It's enslaved Africans or freed enslaved Africans, right? It is on them to tell us what the country is. And Du Bois, his book is about America's failure to understand that it was on them. We'll decide for them. No. Oh, we know what's best for no. Because if you don't address the vision that we have, we're not going to stop revolting. And Lincoln is like, well, we just gave them guns, so we might probably need to think about letting them vote. Then he's killed for that, right? Lincoln is killed because he's scared if we don't let them vote, then what's going to happen? But John Wilkes Booth says, no, you have to be for white supremacy, sir. You got to go. He's succeeded by Andrew Johnson, who was like, look, bring my people back into my country and don't Africanize it. He literally says, we can't let the country be Africanized. Genealogically, we know Andrew Johnson's, right? Not only his predecessors, the other Andrew Jackson, but his successors, right? We're not a people that don't know how to address fascism. We are not that people. Unless we forgot. Andrew Johnson was essentially a fascist. I'm going to appeal to the people that literally were rebelling against the country and invite them back in before I let these Africans decide the fate of the country. Mississippi is at the middle of this, right? Because this is a state where black people are the majority. So if you let them back in to the Union, what's going to happen? Black people might control it. Nah, you got to disenfranchise them. Yes.
January 1866, there's 8,000 Negro troops there and 30 plus legal officers. And by May 1866, they're all removed from Mississippi.
Black soldiers are rebelling. They took the United States Army as a way to get free. The people saw the soldiers as a way to protect their tenuous freedom. Mississippi, white Mississippi, saw the soldiers as a threat. So they appealed to the government that get rid of these soldiers. It happened so early there, right?
Well, 66 is not even close to what ultimately going to happen in the late 1870s.
Right. Most people dated at 1876 with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise and finally got rid of. No, these soldiers had to be removed early, especially in the Deep South, which made the people vulnerable, right? Massacre after massacre. We're talking about Opelousas, Louisiana, or Colfax, or Memphis, right? All of these massacres and race riots happen because the soldiers are taken away. Yes. The alarming amount of destitution among the laboring class. I don't know that's a historical question or current question, but I guess I'll answer both. Obviously, currently, this has a lot to do with the devastation of right-wing neoliberal policy over the last 50 years. That can't be ignored. It is a repudiation of the welfare state that came into being during the New Deal, which has always been a racialized project, right? And so much of that is eviscerated by a right-wing movement in the 1970s that's crystallized in the 1980s. So I think that's the current part of it. historically, the destitution is obviously rooted in the fact that freedom, or emancipation, I should say, doesn't necessarily equal freedom, right? So people were emancipated into a system that they were struggling and fighting to claim as theirs through power, through their own power. They're prevented from doing that. And so what you get instead is a modified version of a welfare state where a place like Mississippi is governed by a liberal or progressive element in the United States government that looks at the population, the black population, as a population that needs to be ultimately paternalistically governed. So y'all got to go back on the plantation, but this time we're nice about it, right? That's under the federal government. That's their version of Reconstruction. We're going to give you a salary. That's what you wanted, right? You wanted to be a wage worker. Like, no, that's not what you wanted. You wanted 40 acres. So imagine if the land had been redistributed rather than people just become wage workers, right? So that might help us understand the destitution. The Freedmen's Bureau, as Du Bois writes in his book, Souls of Black Folk, is a really important experiment. But black people aren't invited to the table when it came to understanding what the goal was of that bureau, right? Black people did have a vision, though, of what emancipation would be. And this is the thing that I try to drill down with my students, right? Because everybody knows 40 acres. Everybody knows that that's a thing. But what people don't quite also know is that the idea of 40 acres was them imagining that land could be not only reclaimed, but remade in the image of people and what people actually need rather than what capital needs. Black people had that vision. They had that awareness. And so that's what didn't happen in Mississippi. And in fact, the opposite happens. Land not only doesn't go to the black folk, it remains in the hands of the rebels. The rebels actually go on a campaign to drain the swampy lands that had not been dedicated to plantation labor. They built levees in the Delta to stop the flooding that would ultimately eviscerate the crops, right? When the Mississippi River flooded. And they created a new class of wealth. That new class of wealth is who ultimately disenfranchises black people. And that's ultimately what the Mississippi Plan was. It creates structural poverty in Mississippi. Because who's doing that labor of picking cotton in the Delta? Us. Now, if we had it to do for ourselves, what would our lives have looked like? Maybe like Mound Bayou, Mississippi, which is an autonomous black community. Isaiah T. Montgomery and others, right? Ironically, it's Jefferson Davis's land, right? But that kind of gives you a glimpse. If you study Mound Bayou, what would we do with the land? Maybe grow food that we can eat. I don't know. Maybe build a school. Like, that imagination was there. It's really beautiful. Like, there's a book that I just read for the first time. It's a classic, I guess. A new classic, despite it's not on the New York Times 100 best list, but Lolita Tademi's book, Red River. It's a novel. And she's looking at her ancestors, the male ancestors. She has two books. Red River is about her male ancestors. Cane River is about her female ancestors. But her ancestors had participated ain't the right word. Victimized isn't either. So I'm trying to find a word. Their lives were ultimately shaped by what happened at Colfax, 1873 in Louisiana. So next door to Mississippi. Essentially, these rural black folk in the swamp, basically a swamp, had decided that they would hold on to their power through the ballot, through the vote. And they elected a Republican. Y'all know, of course, that the parties were different. Let's make sure y'all know that. The party of Lincoln, right? But a Republican municipal government in that area. And they took their guns and they went to City Hall and they occupied City Hall until that government could take its place, right? Until it could be seated. The response of the white community was, black people got guns and they're in our City Hall. And so they got all the neighboring white rural communities to ultimately invade, and they ultimately killed countless black men in the community who were trying to hold on. And the idea, of course, was that we don't have to hold on to it forever. We just have to hold on to it until the federal government sends reinforcements. Then reinforcements never came. And so the reason I raised that is we rarely ask the question of, well, what's on this community's mind? Why would you go to your city hall with guns? What are you thinking about? Don't you know that something bad might happen? And it's a debate, of course, right? Some of the black men are like, look, that's their problem. I'm just about to grow my food over here and y'all do what y'all got to do. But what this showed, of course, is that even people that made that decision, they got killed too. White supremacy was indiscriminate. But what was on their mind? I love this book because the dream is not to be a cotton baron. The dream is not even to be a large landholder. Like, we want to have our piece of land and, make sure that we have somewhere to live, right? What's the dream? A school. The legacy of the descendants of those who were killed in this massacre was, we have to build a school. Each generation, I have to build the school. And the ultimate flow of the novel is, will they ever get their school? And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, why is the emancipation dream of black people to have not only just land, but a school, but places of education? Why? Why did black soldiers stay up at night in the camps, even though the next day they know they probably was going to get killed in the war? But they stayed up late at night to learn how to read. To me, that helps also answer the question of how we address what's happening now with our kids, right? But I think that to circle back to that question from the chat and to bring it back to Du Bois, these people had plans. They're not just waiting around for white folks to say what they need to do. They have plans. But the Mississippi plan was white people's plan. And so, as Du Bois shows us, there's this nuanced and complicated alliance that they try to make with the planter class. The planter class is making an alliance with black people, not because they have black people's best interests at heart, because they want to control the black vote. They want to make sure to maneuver it in the way that they want to maneuver it, but also they want to box out the two other factors. And so the way that I teach Black Reconstruction in America is that chapter 9 is the pivot chapter, right? The price of the disaster. In chapter 9, Du Bois lays out the Reconstruction Project through 4 central players: black people, the planter class. Who were the other 2? The poor whites. Early in the book, he calls in the police force. Black people been critiquing the police. Poor whites, he says, they could go either way. They don't know enough to have a position. What they know is whiteness. Can it be unlearned? And so the planter class is so viscerally pro-capitalist that they will actually support black people's franchise initially because it could be played against the poor whites. Can you imagine? General Alcorn, he's a planter. I'll be a friend to the blacks. To this day, we got a school named after him, HBCU, Alcorn State University. I'll be a friend to the blacks because what I can't allow is them to recognize some common interest with poor people. Can't allow it. It don't work, of course, because the planners can't actually be aligned with black people because they're planners. But they can try to control us, right? And that's where things get really tricky. The northern capitalists are the 4th group. They are liberal, they are progressive, they believe in the black vote, and they're viscerally capitalists. We're industrialists. We're coming into Mississippi because we need cotton to come out of the state. What's the best and most efficient way to do it? These are like the people who are Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs and others, right? What's the best way to, get the best value out of our abilities to maneuver and mechanize and all these nice things? Aren't you just a capitalist? Yes, but I'm nice. If I'm not here, then, the redneck capitalists will take over. It's like, okay. It's like Hortense Spillers in the beginning of the film Dreams Are Colder Than Death. We didn't have a chance. We didn't have a prayer. So you get people like the fascinating figure, John R. Lynch, who ascends to the Secretary of State. Black man. He's making these deals with the devil. Is that what politics is in America? Constantly trying to make a deal with the devil. But he's saying ultimately, like, look, y'all. And Du Bois writes this, if I want, we can go to the text. But he writes this line. He says, if enough of us used our position as people that have access to the ballot and to use it intelligently, we too could play them off against each other. He doesn't say it like that. He said, but to use the ballot intelligently to build power in the black community, right? To use capital against its own interests. Which is, by the way, what the black political figures in South Carolina tried to do and actually were more successful during the same period, right? So Du Bois studied South Carolina first. Says we almost had a dictatorship of the proletariat in South Carolina. Dictatorship of the proletariat, of course, is the idea that we're creating a workers' society. What happens? Well, black people get into the highest office. Every office except governor, right? I don't think there was a lieutenant governor either. But Mississippi has a black lieutenant governor. So does Louisiana. South Carolina's like, yeah, Delaney, we're not going to let you win. Lieutenant Governor Martin R. Delaney almost becomes Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina. But South Carolina sends, I believe, 13 black men to Congress or something crazy like that. Maybe not that many, but it was a lot. Yes. No, no. There was never. I mean, there were attempts, right? But I don't believe that that was ever the case where they got equal compensation. I could be wrong though. I could be wrong. I don't. But yeah, because I remember this was an issue into late 1864. During the this is northern stuff. So just as we were organizing in the South, black people are organizing in the North. The National Equal Rights League. The National Equal Rights League was organized in Syracuse, New York, 1864. And these brothers said, at the top of our list is equal pay for black soldiers. And so if it was still an issue as late as 1864, I don't think it was ever resolved because the war is over. And then we know that during times of peace that there was a huge disparity. So yeah, to answer that question, I don't believe that that was ever resolved. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. So basically what happened is once they got control, nominal control, they were then blamed for corruption. So anything that went wrong is because we got black politicians. And they used that racial appeal to ultimately remove them from office. It took longer than it took in most of the other states. But by 1877, it's done. 1876 is done. And that wasn't even the final nail in the coffin. The final nail in the coffin was the 1895 Constitution of South Carolina, which actually formally disenfranchises black people. And it was actually a constitution that was imagined by a mass murderer, Benjamin Tillman, who to this day, Clemson University, his beloved Clemson, still has stuff named for him on its campus, which is built on the plantation. I don't know how they got me to root for that school when I was younger. It's like that. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry. The question was, you wanted me to finish my thought about what happened in South Carolina. Thank you. Sorry. A similar process happened in Mississippi. And so Du Bois walks us through, like, here's what they actually achieved, right? Despite the fact that the black vote never had full power. He says Negroes never really controlled Mississippi, right? And yet the collaboration between liberals from the North, black people who are maneuvering between this planter class and these liberals, including Adelbert Ames, who comes in from Maine, right? The pejorative term is carpetbagger, right? A northerner who comes into the South. He was more so a radical Republican. The governorship is passing between his hands and Alcorn's hands, and they're like going back and forth. Black people are using that to get things that they need, right? Infrastructure, mostly. And they don't get the thing that they want the most. Land. Ironically, they do get integrated schools. It's hard for us to imagine, right? It's 1870, and they're integrated schools. At least on paper, right? And so these things do manifest, but you have to understand how narrow the window was. Du Bois talks about how they rejected the Constitution initially in 1869. And then Grant is like, look, y'all need to come back. And Mississippi's like, we will never ratify the 13th Amendment. It's like, all right. And so they move on. What about the 14th and 15th? And of course, you know, when does Mississippi actually ratify the 13th Amendment? 2013. They tried to do it in 1995 and messed up the paperwork. So they fixed it in 2013. It's crazy. So all throughout the whole 20th century, they're like, man, maybe we don't necessarily need to. Are they thinking slavery is going to come back? In fact, Ron Walters did a study and said in some parts of Mississippi, slavery continues into the 1960s. This is the environment that Snick walks into, right? But ultimately, they do the same thing that they did in South Carolina and said that ultimately this is corrupt. Black people having power is corrupt. Black people having elected office is corrupt. And they appeal to the poor white base, who, again, all we got is whiteness. And that's where the Mississippi Plan comes from. So the Mississippi Plan, to give a quick, concrete definition, was the campaign of terror and disenfranchisement that allowed for white people to establish a version of white supremacy that Mississippi doesn't relinquish until the 1960s. That campaign of terror means that the White League, the Ku Klux Klan, and other forces now don't need to wear the robe and the mask. They can be open. Reconstruction, again, the most revolutionary period in American history, is violently suppressed. Not only will black people not set the terms and the vision for the rest of the country, black people, you're going to go back to the status of not being people. And that's why I wanted to include Bob Moses in the first day's readings. And so there's a 4-hour panel discussion that we shared on the syllabus. But the end of it was Bob Moses talking for about, I guess it's 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes. It was a full hour? Or the Q&A. Yeah. But what he says is, part of what he says, because he roots this in 1875 too, right? Because that's the year that black people are disenfranchised. 1890 is when they created the new Constitution. And so the Progressive Constitution only lasts for 25 years, roughly, right? 1890, it's so interesting because what's happening on the federal level is the Republicans are moving towards the center as well, right? So as they move to the center, the Supreme Court moves to the center. 1875, the Civil Rights Act. 1883, the Civil Rights Cases, right? Repudiate the Civil Rights Act of 1875 in some ways. Then you get Slaughterhouse and all this other stuff. And then by 1896, Plessy. It's already done by Plessy. It's already done because it gives these populists their whiteness back, right? The poor whites acquire their whiteness back between the 1870s and 1890s. And the Supreme Court is only ratifying what's already in practice with Plessy. So that's happening on the federal level. On the state level, the constitutions are rewritten. If you want to study some of the most legalistic, racist documents in American history, study the constitutions of these states in the 1890s. They are very clear. Black people aren't people. And so Moses roots his discussion there because this idea of constitutional people is a critical lever for understanding the nature of the civil rights struggle, what the stakes were, who could do stuff, who could not do stuff, right? Civil rights simply means who gets to be a citizen, right? The civic and civil, it's the same citizen. It's the same as the city and citizen. These are basically what you can do as a consequence of being a citizen. The problem is America never really resolves the question of who are citizens until you get to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Before that, it's actually not a question. And so Du Bois has this long conversation about the 14th Amendment in his book because they're not sure that they want to allow black people to be people. At least constitutional people. In fact, what should have happened was the whole question of who is a citizenship, who is a citizen, right? Or the abolition of slavery should have actually resolved who could be a citizen at the same time, right? Which needed two separate amendments. And so equality under the law, due process, all of those things happen at the same time, and citizenship is defined largely because they're not sure that this should apply to the peoples who were formerly enslaved. But they ram it down the state's throats, which is why the radical Republicans are an important group to study. You want to come back into the Union? Yeah, you got to have 14th Amendment. You can't free people and give them a non-status. Every subsequent struggle on the federal level is how you enforce that to people who would not accept that these are constitutional people. Which is why I don't have a problem with 14th Amendment originalists. Like, go ahead and be an originalist. Because what's happening with 14th Amendment jurisprudence today? It's protecting white people. It's protecting whiteness. So how do y'all mess that up? Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
It's like when the union says, "I'll bring you back into the union if you ratify the 14th Amendment." Is that even almost? They're doing that almost nominally, right? Because they don't have an apparatus to enforce it in those territories.
Well, the apparatus was military government of Reconstruction, right? But the idea, right? Well, so if you go to the initial years where they're debating this, right? 1867, right? 1868. Reconstruction Act is March 1867. 14th Amendment is 1868. Oh, I keep forgetting to do that. No. So the question is around Derek Bell's concept of interest convergence and whether or not the requirement that the 14th Amendment be ratified in order for these states to re-enter the Union, was it just a question of expedience? Is that? And so for me, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that this is how you strong arm, that this is how you play politics, right? Because people who are radical Republicans actually do believe in the humanity of black people. These are whites that do believe that black people should have things like land and education. There's only two of them. Well, 5, 6, maybe. But it's not a lot. But they have power, right? Charles Sumner has the power to ultimately get people to play along, and Thaddeus Stevens has the power. They're wielding this power, and actually, it's only a committee of 15, right? That's making these interventions. And so Du Bois even debates this a little bit. He says, was this constitutional that you have a committee of 15 deciding? He says it doesn't matter. It's what needed to be done. Because without this, Johnson was going to let everybody back in. Right? And so, yes, it's expedient. But also, they who did not share the vision of a Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner, and there are others, but those are the two main forces, the moral forces, I would say, right? They're not thinking about economic. Some of them are, but Thaddeus Stevens is give these people land. He's from Lancaster, Pennsylvania. He understands the rule. They need land. They don't. And so, no, in the sense that they want the 14th Amendment because without it, they're imagining what actually happens, right? What Bob Moses calls the sharecropper education. They can see that happening where a lot of the politicians couldn't. And so if you did not have that 14th Amendment, what do you have? Right? You have 9 persons operating in an economic system with no protection. It's basically slavery, which is what happens. Because even with the 14th Amendment, because as Derek Bell would show us, right, they don't need it to be enforced. Capitalism doesn't need it to be enforced, right? There is no enforcement mechanism until black people demand one. And progressive whites demand one. Because capitalism can operate it with it or without it. That's the lesson of, abolition democracy and its failures, right? Look, we'll use you as a voting public to get our way, and we'll use you as a non-voting public to get our way, because we're going to get our way. That's their mentality. And the moral force of a Sumner and a Stevens are like, look, these are people that y'all talking about. These are not units of capital. The Northerners never get it, which is why they can turn their backs at the end of the day in 1876. It's like, we're good, we're okay. Stevens and Sumner would have never given up like that, because it wasn't about the industrial development of the country, right? And I also add that the educated elite in the black community are also standing on similar business, right? A Douglas or a Delaney, or every time they speak, it's not in terms of, what is expedient for the country to, no, what do black people need? How do we understand? How do we make them, in Bob Moses' terms, constitutional people? So there's a beautiful part in chapter 9, again, that pivotal chapter of Black Reconstruction, where black people set out their agenda, coming from like the educated elite, the unions, right? And they're very clear. If we're going to be workers, we're going to have full workers' rights. Don't just give us a wage and think, or worse, and think that we're good. Like, no, we're going to have full workers' rights. And if you look at the documents of for instance, the National Colored Labor Union, this is a revolutionary document in labor history, because the labor didn't imagine that they could have power. I mean, Marx and them would come later, right? But this is 1867, 1868. But then white organized labor says, look, we can't get it if y'all with us. It's like, damn, what can we? It's like, are we cooked? And so, yeah, I think it was obviously, a way for them to restore the union. That interest was there, but there's also this other moral interest that's playing a part as well. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's the party of business. And again, like, I really want to emphasize the way that Du Bois talks about it, because I'm gonna do like I do at Howard. Because it's a really beautiful phrase. And so the question was, how does this connect to corporate personhood that comes out of 1884? So we know that the same amendment that creates constitutional personhood for black people is used to create corporate personhood later. And we're still fighting that battle. Like Citizens United, for instance, right? It's 14th Amendment case, right? But here's how Du Bois puts the question of this moment, the interests of this moment. And this is from that pivotal chapter 9. And the part that I'm going to read isn't really the part. It's just part of the part. But on page 327, Du Bois writes, under the leadership of Stevens and Sumner, he's talking about the abolitionists, were beginning to realize the economic foundation of revolution necessary in the South. They saw that the Negro needed land and education, and that his vote would only be valuable to him as it opened the doors to a firm economic foundation and real intelligence. It sounds like this could be written for today, right? If now they could get the industrial North, not simply to give the Negro the vote, but to give him land and give him schools, the battle will be won. Here, however, they were only partially successful. Stevens could not get them to listen to his plan of land redistribution, and Sumner failed in his effort to provide for a national system of Negro schools. But they could and did get the aid of industry, commerce, and labor for Negro suffrage. And this vast step forward, they gladly took. Public opinion followed philanthropy. But, turn to your neighbor and say, but it was guided by big business. This is about 2024. So that's what ultimately happens. And Sumner and Stevens are like, we got to use our allies, but our allies have no moral center. They're guided by big business. And so in that light, should the solution have been, well, let's just walk away? Well, some black people said that. Right? But others of them worked within that contradiction to get the best that they could get. Another beautiful way that he puts it is from page 346. And every time I teach this book, I read this passage because his poetics, number one, but number two, it helps people see that sometimes things can align that help us, but the reason that they help us have nothing to do with the things themselves. Right? And so he uses this metaphor of coincidence. And he uses the solar system. He says, thus by singular coincidence, and for a moment, for the few years of an eternal second in a cycle of 1,000 years, the orbits of two widely and utterly dissimilar economic systems coincided, and the result was a revolution so vast and portentous that few minds ever fully conceived it. For the systems were these. First, that of a democracy, which should, by universal suffrage, establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, ending in industrial democracy. And the other, a system by which a little knot of masterful men would so organize capitalism as to bring under their control the natural resources, wealth, and industry of a vast and rich country, and through that of the world. For a second, for a pulse of time, these orbits crossed and coincided, but their central suns were 1,000 light years apart, even though the blind and ignorant fury of the South and the complacent Philistinism of the North saw them as one. For a moment, we get a revolution, but they were never on our side. And so the evidence of that is the Mississippi Plan. The response of a federal government that supported and needed black people should have been a massive defense and protection of these citizens. That never came. The feds never to this day, like one of the reparations demands needs to be the failure of the state to protect black people in Mississippi for 100 plus years. We're not constitutional people. We don't get the right to be protected from white violence. Charles Payne, in his book, spends the first chapter talking about all the lynchings in the first half of the 20th century in Mississippi. And I'm like, when I first read it, I'm like, isn't this supposed to be a book about organizing? Like, what he spends page after page after page after page. And the reason he's doing that is he's showing us the consequences of the Mississippi Plan. Now, of course, he talks about the fact that we didn't take L's the whole time. In fact, we should read that book alongside a book called We Will Shoot Back by Akinyele Umoja, Armed Resistance, Mississippi Freedom Struggle. Because we weren't just catching L after L after L after L after L. But the fact that we were at war speaks to the fact that our civil rights, what it means to be a citizen, never came into the equation. These aren't people. And so the state can kill with impunity. Representatives of the state can kill with impunity. I'll never forget reading about a politician in Mississippi killed by another politician in broad daylight on the street. And nothing happened. This impunity continues and persists. And it is not that we weren't fighting back. It was that when something happened to us, nothing happened to the perpetrators. And that creates this notion that we don't possess constitutional personhood. Which means there have to be other options. Either you fight for it or you build alternative societies, institutions. You fight for that recognition or you create alternatives. And black people did both. We did both. And so it's already time. I know we have one question, and I want to make sure that everybody's in the chat is good as well. So yeah. Okay. He said which, so read it again, I'm sorry. Kermit Roosevelt, okay. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So the other thing about constitutional histories is that, you know, first of all, Du Bois says we do a fetish worship of the Constitution in this country. You know, he said it in 1935. If you look at the world, constitutions get rewritten all the time, not just amended, but let's start from scratch and start over, right? Somehow that's not on the table ever in the United States. But people have done their own constitutions, right? John Brown had a constitution. The Republic of New Africa had a constitution, and many other groups, right? And so it's not that, you know, people don't imagine that there can be alternatives, so that we are not just subject to whatever the Constitution says. But at the very least, we have to imagine that the Civil War amendments should be sacred, right? They shouldn't be able to reimagine that as a way to protect white supremacy. And so if you're going to go to law school, like, master that conversation, because that's going to be on the table for the next generation or two, if they're still in America. But yeah, so yeah, thank you for that.
Frustrated liberation that Du Bois was talking about, as far as like trial
Mm-hmm.
And so Du Bois could have written that today, but now you add a layer of generational amnesia,
Yeah.
and how exactly, because he brings up this conundrum, but he doesn't actually like present the solution for it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
not to say that there is a solution, like that's something that we have to. It's a historic thing that we have to go through and live through.
Yeah.
But I wish I definitely want to know some thoughts on that, and I also want to touch on balance, right? All of the things that we're looking at, one, the ways in which we were able to use balance, or at least the assertion of having weapons, having guns,
Mm-hmm.
to help our political power,
Mm-hmm.
but also state balance, and
Right.
how that has systemically kept us where we're at, and
Mm-hmm.
just almost disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
Like the balance is there, but we don't acknowledge it, we don't validate, legitimize it
Mm-hmm.
in a way, because then when it's turned to us, like our balance is always delegitimized.
Right. Right.
But theirs isn't, and not only is it legitimized, it's disappeared. It's like it's not even happening.
Right.
Right. So yeah, all that, that frustration is still frustrating. It's frustrating.
Yeah.
Right. Like how exactly do we approach this then?
Yeah.
If any contour we take is
Mm-hmm.
one, like taking the legs out by violence, be it by the state or
Mm-hmm.
by our military or whatever,
Right.
supported by the state,
Right.
or the capitalists who can just pull out our like basic needs
Yeah.
and sort of throw us off.
Yeah. So the question is, number one, starting with Du Bois's conundrum and thinking about these relationships between alliances that work for a moment but then don't work in another moment, and then also how do we think about the delegitimation of self-defense and violence in our communities in this particular moment. So just want to shout out my colleague Felicia Denard, who has a whole day devoted to the question of violence and self-defense. That's going to be on July 31st. So when she's here, there's a whole day devoted to that particular question. So stay tuned for that. But it's interesting. Like, how do we maneuver around political expedience and what might be temporary situations to complex questions? And I think that's how we might consider elections in total, right? But we have to be organized in order to consider it that way. And I think that's the thing that you mentioned, the memory of the past as part of your question. It's like, yeah, we have to understand what is politically expedient and what is the center. Like, what is the difference between us making a move and then standing on the thing that we have to stand on all the time, forever and ever and ever and ever. And to me, that comes from being grounded in community and institutions. And if we're not there, then we don't know what to stand on. So it starts from that. And then to the question of like self-defense, Black people didn't stop defending themselves. So I think your question speaks to that, but it's often delegitimized by the state because the state can't imagine self-defense as an option for Black people, because I think that state still hasn't resolved what it means for us to be constitutional people. And that's at the core of all of these legal fights that we're seeing. Which is why, again, this course is only one of many courses that we've created. That's why we also have a course on Black Power. That's why we also have a course on the Sixth Pan-African Congress, because we had many other options. And I think that us linking to international struggles was all about that. It was about recognizing that there's a limit to understanding that the political theater in the United States is the way. It's one of many ways, right? And the question of violence is why they read Fanon so much, right? They're reading Fanon in Alabama in 1964. It's because they're recognizing the limits. And we too have to understand the limits and work at the limits. I talk about this in my book of Black Studies, that the limits of a particular thing aren't a place of lack, right? Working at the limits allows us to see things differently and see beyond the thing. And so it's a productive space to work at the limits, to work at the end of the rope, so to speak, right? And so, yeah. I'm trying to talk fast because we're out of time. But yeah, that's kind of, again, this is not we got 8 more days. So yeah. Thank you all. Yeah. And I'm going to hang around. So we will end it formally here, but I'll hang around. And shout out to people online. We'll see y'all tomorrow. And again, my email is joshfmyers@gmail.com. You can hit me up with questions, concerns, feedback, whatever you want to do. See you all tomorrow at the same time. Email is Josh, JOSHFMYERS, Myers, @gmail.com. All right, you're welcome.